I noticed a rather, to me, disturbing trend. On the one hand, the program is designed to help protect service members and ensure they're safe. But the way it's being implemented on the ground is a prohibition that if it's violated, even unwittingly or unknowingly or innocently, service members are being separated for that with very limited opportunity to advocate for themselves.
Max, welcome to the Point of Impact. I'm so glad to have you here.
Great to be here, Aaron.
Well, I tell you what, I read your article, Task and Purpose. It seems like this Operation Supplement Safety is well-intended, but it's not working like it should. So that's what I invited you on to tell us a little bit, tell the audience, the Disruptor Nation, a little bit about what OPSS is. And tell me what your opinion is on how it's working and functioning today and what we can do about it.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and thank you for having me on. Before I get started, I just want to say that the views in this article, as are those on my podcast, are my own and don't represent the DoD or any of its components. The problem, as I see it, with OPSS is, as you said, it's a very well-intentioned effort. It was stood up by the DoD as a program to help service members make sure what they were putting in their body are the safest thing. But what it's actually done is something quite different. And the results on the ground have been that we're taking the best young men and women in this country, the ones who are signing up to serve our military, and we're tossing them aside.
So it's a way to safeguard, or at least it's intended to safeguard our service members from ingesting, from using supplements that could be potentially harmful, correct?
That's correct. It essentially comprises a list of prohibited substances, actually a few lists, as well as some very helpful information on the dangers of some of these substances. And it's actually in some ways, very well-designed resource. Aspects of it are, and in other ways, it's a little more problematic. And I'm happy to get into all of those technical aspects as well as the good, the bad, and the ugly of the program.
Well, what's the major issue that you're finding with it right now?
The major issue that I experience it requires a little bit of background. My job in the military is I'm a defense counsel. So I defend service members accused of all kinds of misconduct. And, most of it is the typical stuff you'd expect in the military, people who get in fights, people who use controlled substances. But I noticed a rather, to me, disturbing trend, which was that a lot of these young people who were taking supplements that were widely available on the open market, that weren't illegal in any state, were having them found in their rooms and being told that they were being administratively separated from the military for violating this DoD instruction. And what that DoD instruction is it's the instruction that establishes this program. So there's a little bit of a discordance. On the one hand, the program is designed to help protect service members and ensure they're safe. But the way it's being implemented on the ground is a prohibition that if it's violated, even unwittingly or unknowingly or innocently, service members are being separated for that with very limited opportunity to advocate for themselves.
Okay. So it's turned from an advisory or like a early warning list to something that's punitive. It's actual DoD program and policy. So it's punishable by UCMJ, right? So
yes, and we could have an argument, and the technical legal arguments. If this were charged, say, at a court martial, we would have the arguments about whether it is what we call a punitive order, which is a very technical thing. Not all orders are punishable. However, when it comes up in this kind of a form, there isn't really much room to have that legal debate. These just are bureaucratic processes that go on with very little opportunity for intervention. And so when we're creating a policy that's going to be implemented through that kind of a program, it's very important to understand the policy has to work the way it's intended, because there isn't going to be an opportunity for the adversariality that makes, say, the criminal justice system work.
You have a pretty unique insight into this as a defense counsel for the capital region. As a Marine, though, I'm interested in what brought you to the position you're in now. You went to Yale Law. You were a Schwarzman fellow. Did you studied in China?
I did.
And how did you come to what led you to the Marines?
Well, when I was in China, I guess I should start way at the beginning, because I grew up in San Francisco, where very few people joined the military. And I, in fact, encountered a lot more anti-military people growing up than I did pro-military people. I don't actually think I met a recruiter until I was in law school and called one and said I wanted to join the Marine Corps. So coming from that background, the military was never on the table for me until I was in China, where I had the good fortune of being in a small building on the campus of Tsinghua with all the other Schwarzman scholars, many of whom had come from the service academies. And I found myself gravitating towards those people and really admiring their commitment to public service. And I came to understand that the military isn't just all about, crazy people with guns, as I had grown up with. It's about serving a mission, and a mission that's greater than any one of us. And it's about being part of a brotherhood that we're all part of. So that's what led me to, after I went to law school, which was already in the books, before I went to Schwarzman, I started to think really hard about joining the service and ended up in the Marine Corps.
Interesting. Is the military in the family?
Not really. Like many Americans, I have grandfathers who and grandparents who were participated in the wars when it was more of a all of country effort. But certainly no one in my parents' generation was part of the military. My cousin so happens to be, she just got out as a Navy pilot. Other than that, no military involvement.
Yeah, I absolutely knew my entire life until about a month before I enlisted that I would never be in the military. So I understand that. But how about law? Was this something you pursued from an early age, that you knew you were going to go into law?
It's funny. I never knew I was going to go into law, but growing up, everyone told me that. It was like many lawyers, I was told constantly as a child, stop arguing, wait until you go to law school. And I said, well, I'm not going to law school. And they were right. So when I was in college, that's just what I ended up doing. Sort of just fell into taking a few law school classes as a college student, enjoying them and saying, hey, I might try this out.
What led you to the DC area? It was just an assignment? Did you pursue the Capital Region Defense Council?
So in the Marine Corps, our biggest duty stations for Judge Advocate are West Coast. So that's Pendleton, beautiful California, where I'm from. Lejeune, which is North Carolina, not quite as beautiful, but still a lot of stuff going on there. Operationally, Okinawa, same thing. Lots going on, far from the flagpole, a lot of cool stuff getting done there. And then there's Quantico, which is right next to the flagpole. It's lots of suits and not necessarily the place where most Marines want to be. But I have the good fortune of being married to my husband, who lives in Boston, and Quantico was the closest place. So it was a pretty simple story. I put it first so I could be closest to him.
When did Operation Supplement Safety catch your attention?
It caught my attention. I started as a defense counsel back in November of last year. So I've been on the job for about a year. And a big part of the job of a defense counsel, which is a little different from, say, a public defender, is we do a lot of just consultations. We have days where service members can come in and ask us anything. And that's important because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the legal processes and things that service members experience are things where they don't rate a lawyer. So your only opportunity to get legal advice is if you either pay thousands of dollars to hire someone privately, or you come in and see me or one of my colleagues for free. And I had one, then I had two, and I had three, and I had all these young privates, PFCs, Lance Corporals who were coming in saying, hey, I bought this thing at GNC and I had a room inspection and they found it and they're telling me I'm getting separated.
Mm-hmm.
What the heck? And the word, of course, isn't heck. And I looked at it and I said, what the heck? Also not using heck. And so that piqued my interest and I started to look into it and I was really surprised and disappointed with what I found.
You can find GNC is right in the exchanges. So there's substances being sold on base that will get service members separated. And I'm not talking about the Class 6. I'm talking about supplements. And I mean, this seems pretty contradictory. We've got this administration, Secretary Hegseth, talking about restoring the lethality of the military. Right? And he's all about fitness, and he's changing he's changing military fitness standards across the board. So I know that coming from EOD background myself, and many friends in the Special Forces arena, EOD, of course, plenty of Marines, and the supplementations, protein, pre-workout, all this kind of stuff. It's pretty much commonplace across the board. So now we're talking about these tripwires, so to speak. In essence, what is OPSS? And tell me about how it's not being utilized. What is the problem here? Is it enforcement, communication, policy problems? Where's the disconnect?
So I think it's all of the above. And to get into that, I'll start with the policy. So what is the policy? The policy is established by a DOTI. That DOTI says that there has to be a policy to educate and to create a database of supplements that are dangerous and should be prohibited. And the way that the DoD has implemented that is through a website. That website is OPSS. OPSS has, as I mentioned, some good resources on it. It has some information about how some of these supplements can be dangerous to you. And if you Google, you can see all kinds of news stories. One very well known one is about a supplement called Jack 3D, which I used in high school, and it contains some stimulants that can cause heart palpitations and can cause real damage to service members. So in the 2010s, this effort was stood up to help prevent these preventable deaths of young, healthy people because of supplements that were dangerous. What happened? What happened was the people in charge of OPSS started to create a list. And to create that list, they drew from a variety of sources. They drew from some more typical sources, such as the DEA's schedules of controlled substances, things that the government has decided are illegal. It also drew from some more unusual sources, such as the World Anti-Doping Agency list, which has all the lists of stuff that professional athletes can't use because they're unfair. So this list cobbles together a variety of sources that had very different purposes, both from each other, as well as from the stated purpose of this list originally. And the result is that there are some very assiduous people who run it, who are updating it constantly. And so I just went on the list this morning before this podcast, and it said last updated January 1st, 2026, today. So you have a list that's constantly updated, dynamically changing. You have a DOD that's interpreted as prohibiting the consumption of substances on that list. And you have service members who, despite a requirement in that DOD that they're educated on these things in entry-level training, I'm not aware of any service that actually implements that education. Certainly the Marine Corps doesn't. And the first they hear of this is when Gunny finds it in their barracks room. So there's a policy failure there in light of the fact that what is actually being created there as a prohibition doesn't really make sense, because the purpose should be about education and harm reduction. So there's a policy failure. You also asked about implementation and enforcement. And like many things in the military system, there's been a taking away of command discretion, certainly at least by law. And so commands are in a tough position where often what their lawyers are telling them is, oh, treat this the same as any drug, zero tolerance policy. This is a prohibited substance. They can't be using it. And if they are, they're processed out. Well, there's a big difference between a service member who's snorting coke up their nose on the weekend versus one who's maybe taking some sort of chemical they brought online to do a little better in the PFT. One of those service members is pretty well aligned with the goals of our current secretary and current administration in terms of making sure our warfighting abilities are at their maximum. And another one of those is not well aligned at all, but we're treating them the same way.
I know I'm about to ask a kind of a dumb question because I've been asking a few of my friends who are former commanders, and the military is not the TSA, right? If you get caught with, say, a pocket knife and a carry-on, they're not going to let you on. Let you through security. But even if the policy doesn't really differentiate, how is it that we're getting to the point where service members are being separated because there's a trace of ephedra or something in their supplement that they bought in GNC on base? It doesn't seem there should be at least a little intuition here, a little common sense. How is it that this became a black and white policy?
That's a good question, and it's one that I don't think has an easy answer. It certainly doesn't have a concrete answer. And to be fair, I'm sure I only see the bad situations, right? If a commander does the right thing and says, hey, soldier, don't do that again. Hey, soldier, don't be careful what you buy, and sort of just leaves it be, that soldier is never going to come to my office. I'm never going to see that Marine. So to be clear, what I'm talking about here is the points where that sort of common sense system breaks down.
As an NCO, I would have, if I'd caught one of my soldiers with something that was prohibited like that, I'd say, hey, that's on the, that's on the list, and, double check it, make sure, and get rid of it. But these things are getting elevated pretty quickly. So, I mean, it just, I guess to me, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
And I'm fully in agreement with you there. And all I can tell you is that that's not what some NCOs are doing. When these substances are located, sometimes there are circumstances around them that maybe this is, for whatever reason, the NCO has it out for this person or whatever it is. But the existence of a policy that allows for that to happen, whether the underlying reason is a personal dislike of that Marine or soldier, or whether the reason is just that someone feels like they have to really enforce the rules and can't sweep things under the rug, whether it's inability to counsel a service member and just a decision to just, hey, I'm going to rely on the rules. Whatever those reasons are, the system allows that to be escalated to the point where this service member is getting what we call a paper separation, a short form administrative separation, where they're just going to be processed out and not going to have the opportunity to really make their case.
I definitely want to dig into that a little bit more. But let's say the troops, they want to stay above board. Mm-hmm. They don't want to break the policy. They want to make sure that they're buying supplements that aren't prohibited, don't have prohibited ingredients. I went to this website and tell me right at the base level, on the ground, this website, What are the challenges with doing the search?
Well, there are a few challenges. So first of all, I mentioned we've been talking about a list. And the website actually has a couple different lists on it. And it's not exactly clear which one. There's this list of prohibited supplement ingredients. It's quite short. And then there's a list that's just called the DOD prohibited list. And it's a little bit unclear on this website. What do those lists really mean? And certainly as lawyers, me and my colleagues have kind of looked at this and say, we can't really figure it all the way out. But I think the main list, at least as far as the lawyers figure it out, is this one called the DOD prohibited list. So let's say you pull up that particular list, which happens to be the longest one. Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, it's not a list. It's a search box. So there's no place to actually see a full list, alphabetical or otherwise, of every substance. Instead, what they've perhaps helpfully done is offered a search box where you can type something in and see whether it's prohibited. And not only that, but it has not just one name for substances, but multiple different names. So helpful enough, right? Well, have you ever tried to spell dicyclomethane?
Not once.
I'm not even sure if I said it right. But you have to spell things correctly. There's a little bit of wiggle room for some things. They put a few common misspellings in there, but if you spell it wrong, the website's going to tell you it's not on the prohibited list. And so you have to put in every ingredient exactly how the website expects it in order to figure out what's in your product. That also means, and whether it's prohibited, that also means that you can't put in the brand name. If one of these supplements has 20, 30 different ingredients, you have to sit there in the GNC, pulling up this website on your phone, thumb typing all of these chemical names and doing it completely accurately. Does that sound like something we should be expecting, the 18-year-old PFC straight out of high school to do every time he buys a supplement on base?
I know a couple. I've known plenty of terrific troops, awesome soldiers that had trouble spelling their own names. So,
absolutely,
no, that sounds like challenge number one.
Yes, and so thinking about what would, I don't want to get to this too soon, but what would actually something that makes sense look like? Certainly, it has to be something where there is a safe place to buy things, and that starts with having things on base that are completely vetted. And credit where credit is due, we've had a lot fewer of those incidents that we had many news reports say around the time OPSS was getting started of dangerous things being in these supplement stores. We've had less of that. And I also, to be frank, am not aware of a case where a product that was bought on base and that could be proven to have been bought on base resulted in an administrative separation. But even in those cases, I've heard of situations where someone has been put on a promotion hold or been restricted for months while they have to go talk to the substance abuse control officer of the unit. When they haven't abused substances, they just happened to buy something and luckily saved the receipt.
Welcome to the military. Okay, but back to the website. The search box is one way. And then there are some links below this, because I went there, I tried this out. And for one, there is no printable, there's no actual list of the prohibited substances. It is just a search box. So it's like they made this list of prohibited ingredients, not even the products themselves, like the end purchase item. It's what's inside it. And you can't find a list. I looked on that website and it actually loops back on itself, back to that search box. So why is it masked like that?
It's a great question. It's a great question. Why is it masked like that? My best guess is that that's required by the fact that they update it so frequently, and that I imagine, although you'd have to do a FOIA request to figure this out, that they probably have automatic things feeding into this website. So what I would guess is, every time that World Anti-Doping Agency list gets updated, OPSS probably automatically pulls from that and updates its own list And it's tough to have something dynamic when it is a list on a website, just as a practical matter. So with the search box, that says, last updated today, so you have to check it every week or every day or what? That's how they have chosen to implement it.
All the same, though, the search box is an overlay, right? There's a search box on everything. Everything on the internet, everything in your Windows or Mac, the Office tools, everything's got a search bar. But that list is online. It's there. That's where the search bar leads to. And there was something like a substances index list or something on there. And I went to that thinking that was the list. And so it was apple cider vinegar and chocolate, caffeine. What the heck is this? I don't even know what that is. But there is just the simple prohibited items list is not available. The education part, the policy itself does say that commanders are responsible for dissemination and instruction, education, all of that. So if these troops are getting blindsided after they've purchased, some supplements with, prohibited ingredients, why aren't the commanders being taken to task here? Or are they?
Well, like many things in the military, we ask our service members to do a lot. We ask our commanders to do a lot too. And if you went through every single DOTI and, not to mention all the Marine Corps orders and, Army directives and all that put affirmative duties on commanders, you probably would have a list that you never finish before a new one appears. And so the question is twofold. First is, why aren't commanders being held accountable for failing to do this? And the answer to that is that, at least up to now, there hasn't been a good accountability mechanism. That may change if more service members who are facing this situation go to their members of Congress, if more articles get written and more word gets out that this is happening. Maybe we will see a change. But until then, what incentive does a commander have to put themselves out on a limb, potentially going against with what their lawyers say, to stop a separation that they may well themselves think is unjust, but that prevents, creates certain risks for them if they don't go along with it? That's a lot to ask of a commander who, maybe at their, 15, 18-year mark and doesn't want to ruffle feathers and just wants to get their way to the next promotion or the next duty station, and is not going to go out on a limb for some PFC or Lance Corporal, no matter how high performing they are. And that's sad to say, but I know it's the case, because all the time in my office, we have separation proceedings for service members who everyone at their unit thinks they're great. And you step back and you say, well, why are we here? Well, we're here because this is what someone thinks is required to comply with a directive. And it goes back to the fact that we can hold commanders responsible, but it's tough to do that when we tell them. And when I say we, I really am meaning we as lawyers, often that are increasingly more involved in the military, tell them that their hands are tied.
Well, compliance, you said it, comply. The directive actually says that the whole chain is responsible for compliance. So again, why is it the end user is the only one who's being receives the punishment or the separation?
Because we don't have good accountability mechanisms for the rest of it. We do for an individual, and many of our accountability mechanisms are, commanders get relieved for sure, right? You can have various people along the chain get relief. Sometimes that happens. There are anecdotal reports, for example, of some of the people who were in charge of vetting supplements for the PX getting relieved in the wake of some of these scandals, like the Jack 3D stuff. I think a few people got relieved. But again, the difference there is that what's most ready at hand, the ADCEP, is the NJP, is the counseling. That's easy. You check the box, you're done. So when you start talking about holding those higher level people accountable, suddenly the question becomes a lot more complicated. There needs to be a lot more people involved in that decision. And it's simply just not as easy the higher up you go to hold somebody accountable.
So you mentioned earlier about this paper separation. What they're not getting Article 15. They're not getting court martial. Wouldn't this be something where at least they have an opportunity to argue, to defend their case?
So sometimes, under the regulations that apply to administrative separations, if a service member has 6 years or fewer of time in service, they don't get an adversarial proceeding, often known as an ADCEP board or board of inquiry for officers. They're entitled to submit matters. So essentially, you get a piece of paper that says, hey, you're going to be separated. Within a few days, you can submit some papers to say why you shouldn't be separated, or understand, you make your case for why you should get an honorable discharge as opposed to general, and so on. And so you have the opportunity to say something on paper, but you don't have the chance, unless you're more than 6 years, to have a proceeding to fight for yourself. Now, the commander can exercise their discretion and to give that person a board where they would then get a lawyer like me. They would get a little more opportunity. It's still not the full protections of a trial, but it's a much more robust proceeding in which I've never heard of somebody who goes through that process getting separated for this kind of thing. But that's not what happens. And it's because those boards are quite expensive for the command. It costs, tens of thousands of dollars to have one of these. It costs the time of personnel. It costs a lot of administrative burden. And that's the reason why the military has this ability to separate entry-level people easily. Because if you have a recruit who, smoking weed on liberty on the weekend, you don't need to have a huge proceeding. You can just kick them out, right? That would destroy our military if we had to do a trial, a full-blown trial every time that happened. The problem, though, is not with the availability of that mechanism to do a short-form separation. It's with a policy that was not thought out well enough on the front end and is now getting fed into that system for short-form paper separations.
So it's the unintended consequence of almost like a loophole in the policy. So is this the best defense for troops to request masked or to request a court martial? Can they?
Yeah, none of this is, my best advice to the troops facing the situation is to go to your defense services office, where we can do a lot more for you in your specific case. In general, yeah, you request everything you can. Certainly for this kind of thing, you go even further. If you have the ability, you go to your member of Congress, you make all the noise you can to try to get yourself noticed and to try to change that calculus for the commander, where suddenly the liability isn't, with keeping you and giving you more rights, the liability is kicking you out the door without it. And so if you can change as a service member that risk calculus for the CO or for whoever's in charge of processing you out for this stuff, you can make a big difference potentially. And we've had cases, right, where, people have advocated for themselves and have gotten themselves an ADCEP board. And when they get themselves an ADCEP board, they do a lot better. Now, you asked about on the front end, what can a service member do to avoid getting this situation in the first place? And unfortunately, the only answer to that is when you buy a product, you go through that ingredient list and you type it in exactly perfectly into that box. If you do that, you probably will never have to see me. But for those of people who do not have the time or energy to do that, or don't have the good fortune to listen to this podcast until they're in that situation, the best option is to go to your defense services office, to call everyone you can, and to try to fight for your career, and don't just take it because they say, hey, you're getting separated.
So there are these the Marines, sailors, airmen, Coast Guard, Space Force, soldiers. They're all, usually I'm guessing the entry level, lower enlisted that are tripping up, buying the wrong product, and then they're somehow getting caught, say in the barracks. The NCO or officer just catches, just sees the product, knows the ingredient that's prohibited. And again, it goes back to, if the person who catches it knows, why wasn't there training? But I know I'm asking the same question again. It goes back to that thing. If they know, where's the training? If this person knows they can see that product, why wasn't their troop informed? It goes back to the communication piece. If you could make the corrections yourself, how could we get this well-intended program to operate like it's supposed to?
I think you can attack that problem on a few different levels. I think the highest level, the problem we have is that in this country, the FDA doesn't regulate supplements. So in the first place, we have supplements on the market that are potentially dangerous to everyone, not just troops, right? We all have the same bodies that probably shouldn't be on the market. So ideally, we'd have a better regulatory regime to make sure that the products that are available for anyone to purchase are safe. Now, obviously, that's not something that's within the military's control. So then at the next level down, the DoD level, what do? I think we have to do a lot more on our own as a military to decide what is actually dangerous, what is actually worth prohibiting. And if we're going to prohibit something, then we have to have education on those specific things. It needs to be part of boot camp. You need to have a class at boot camp where you are sat down and you are told, hey, here are the things you need to look out for. Here's what you can't buy. You need to check the ingredients label. Here's how you do that. Here's the website where there is an actual list that's not a million substances long, that is limited to the stuff that actually poses a clear and present danger to service members if such products are on the market. And guess what? If you buy something at the PX, at anything on base, all those things are going to be vetted, and we're going to make sure that those are vetted. And if they're not, if we screw up, if you have a receipt from the PX, that's a defense. We're not going to mess you up if we messed up. And all of that needs to be conveyed to service members. So that's at the policy level. This policy needs to be rejiggered so that it does not have a punitive element. It needs to be purely education focused. And we're only punishing things that are willful violations of the rule. And so that where someone is taking something that they have been told they should not take and cannot take. And even then we should be very cautious, because we're not talking about recreational drugs. We're talking about things that at their worst are in the category of a steroid. Something that we certainly don't want to have a culture where people have to put harmful things in their body to meet the standards, as has happened in some kinds of special forces communities. I know as an EOD guy, you probably understand that. It's not great when you have pressure for everyone to be taking this stuff that isn't great for you. But is a punitive approach really best?
I know a few guys who have little GNCs in their rooms, right?
Right.
I've met a couple of ODA guys who would quote unquote pop hot for supplements on any what was the Olympic banned substances. Anyways, there's plenty of that in the military. Please go on.
And I'll say, and just so we talked about the sort of national policy level, we talked about the military policy level, but then there's that, what can you do as an NCO or as a CO? you can have those classes still. They don't have to be in boot camp. There's nothing stopping you as a SACO, as someone, as a CO, from implementing these classes, especially when you see it not as an individual failure, but as potentially a failure of the system. And similarly, you have to understand that when those papers come across your desk, whether it's a CO, a first sergeant, a sergeant major, and someone is telling you we're separating this person, you have to look into why. And you have to listen to the circumstances of why that happened. And you have to make your own decision ultimately of whether it makes sense. Because in some systems, Israel is a good example. In some militaries, the lawyers make the final call. In Israel, if the lawyer says to the commander, you can't make that strike, commander can't make the strike. That's not how our system works. All of us, me, your SJA, you're an advisor. The ultimate responsibility lies with the command. So if that commander thinks this is a good Marine, this is a good soldier, they may have violated a rule, but in my judgment, that violation is not something that warrants separation. They should make that call and make that call fearlessly. So at the end of the day, at every level, we have choices to do something differently and to do the right thing. And we just have to make the right choice.
I think this is where the biggest, I would say, betrayal is, or the biggest deviation from the original intent is that our chain of command, the chain of responsibility, they're there to support the troops. And we have this policy of becoming the most lethal fighting force in the world. Again, we want strong, warriors, lethal warriors, and we're busting them for taking supplements that will make them stronger, or faster, better, whatever, smarter, and it's like a rubber stamp all the way up that chain, where the commanders almost seem like they're blind to the paperwork or something. So yeah, I totally agree that there should be that trust, that intuition, that support of their troops, and back down the chain, just the education. This is something that will do more harm than good for you. What else do we need to do to make this better?
I think the only piece we haven't touched upon yet goes back to that idea of the chain. Because back to that core question, like, this makes no sense. Make it make sense. Why is this happening? It's happening because our military, especially in a time of peace, thank God for peace, but we're increasingly tied up in a bureaucracy. We're tied up in a circumstance where so much of the responsibility is just diffused among so many people that it's very easy to say, oh, not my call, not my problem, even if you're in that position of actual authority. Incumbent upon all of us to think about, I'm going to take on this responsibility, not just I'm going to do what I'm expected to, but I'm going to take on this responsibility to look carefully at this package. I'm not going to trust that all the people who had this separation package before it got to my desk looked at it carefully. I'm going to take the time to actually look at it carefully. And that's how good COs work, right? That's why good COs are sometimes having a soldier come before them for an Article 15 and are finding that soldier not guilty, because they know that while their NCOs are very reliable and they need to trust them, they also need to verify. And it's that piece of shared responsibility, but also individual responsibility that's really important in circumstances like these.
What should the commanders be doing right now to help their troops, to help themselves prepare, or make a little noise further up the chain?
So I'll focus on commanders first need to be aware. They need to be aware of when this is happening in their unit, when their NCOs are finding prohibited substance in rooms. And then if that happens, they have to ask questions. Why is this happening? Is there a command culture that's making people think they need to reach for supplements to be better versus just doing the PT? Like, do we need to create a different expectation? Do we need to do more education? Because, hey, this soldier has actually these soldiers all had super dangerous stuff in their room that is messing them up and making them have seizures, I'm sure they wouldn't have taken that if they had known that. So both getting the information, identifying the problem, and finally, being a thoughtful part of the response. So that goes back to the piece of, when that class is held, attending that class, standing up in front of that class for the first 2 minutes before you go on to your next part of the day and explaining why it was important for you to order the SACO to put together this class. What your expectations are as a commander for people with regard to supplements, communicating that. And then finally, when that package comes across your desk, when someone gets caught for violating it, looking specifically into the circumstances of that case and asking yourself, is this a case with someone who's not following the rules, who has no discipline, who isn't cut out for this organization? Or is this someone that was doing their very best to be the kind of person that our secretary wants them to be, who's focused on improving themselves, and who maybe did it in a way that wasn't the way we want them to do it, but it's an opportunity for individual education, for improvement, and for a second chance. And if a CO is asking themselves all those questions and doing those things, I don't think that unit's going to have a problem with people getting separated for these kinds of supplements.
All right, this next question is opinion. Right? What are your thoughts on this? Now, I'm a Gen Xer. I grew up in the 80s, 90s. I remember the whole steroids in the professional wrestling, like when the Hulk Hogan came out, and it was such news. I'm like, wait a second, it's just a professional wrestling. Who cares? But now, when it's the military, and other nations, China, Russia, Russia doesn't have any qualms about juicing their Olympians. They're definitely not their military, using everything to their advantage. Absolutely. And going back to the 80s, remember what was it, the Universal Soldier and some of those other movies? Why aren't we being a little more lenient, or even trying to create an army of Captain Americas? Instead, it's like we're intentionally tying one hand behind our backs when it comes to becoming this lethal fighting force. What do you think? Should we just kind of maybe lift this whole OPSS completely and let our soldiers use anything? What do you think?
This is a great question. And again, it's one with multiple levels. And I think it's helpful to start at the highest level, which is that we're facing a set of incredibly difficult national security challenges right now, and our military needs to step up to meet that. I think we have to start answering this question from understanding what those challenges are and what is needed to meet them. Do we need a ton of Captain Americas to counter China and Russia and North Korea? Is that the capability we need, or is it something different? So starting with that, and once we have an answer to that question, that might inform how we're going to proceed. Because certainly it's true that we can't fight with a hand tied behind our back. But historically, we fought very differently from some of those countries. Historically, it's been important to the American military to say, follow the laws of armed conflict. And that's not because we're super nice or want to tie our hands behind our backs. It's because we understand that a huge amount of our strength comes from our moral authority and soft power. And that soft power might mean that, when we're in Afghanistan, some people are actually going to want to try to help us and be interpreters for us, as opposed to run away from us like they ran away from the Soviets, right? Because they know that we are different. And that is an important augment to our fight. So, again, thinking about it from a purely the perspective of how do we make ourselves more effective, we have to make that choice. And it goes along with decisions like this one. Are we the kind of military that thinks if we tell our soldiers, hey, you need to put all these toxic chemicals in your body to make sure you can perform at the maximum and shorten your own lifespan, are those people going to be motivated to fight effectively or not? Certainly there's room, right? A lot of these substances, and we have new substances coming out, myostatin inhibitors are one example. We also have, these new GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic, right? These are things that actually have very limited harmful effects and might be helpful to make our people stronger. The problem with steroids is, and a lot of these other substances that led to the creation of OPSS, is they had real dangers. We can't have soldiers who are, taking supplements to stay up, all night, and maybe that's making them more effective, and maybe that's making them have seizures, right? So again, framing all of it through a combat effectiveness perspective, framing all of it through the perspective of our national security, we have to make those decisions. And at the end of the day, I think you're right. We probably need to come to a system where we're a lot more deliberate about what we specifically prohibit. And anything that we specifically prohibit has to be for a good reason. And we can't just be throwing every list into our big master list and just punishing everything. That's a rough and unstrategic way to do it. But do we want to get rid of every prohibition? Probably not. We probably don't want people putting stuff in their bodies that's going to screw with them, because it's not going to help with morale if we make that the expectation. It's also not going to help with our combat effectiveness.
Certainly far more nuance to it on both sides, or maybe short-term benefits, but some long-lasting detrimental effects of certain substances. So maybe it makes you better in the interim, but maybe not as a long-term fighting service member, or even after service. I can see that point there. And then again, there's also the fact that some of these substances, maybe service members have the wrong impression about them, and there's no real benefit except, like I said, keeping them awake a little bit longer when they should be getting some rest and recuperation, which is we all need a little bit better. So, did we cover it all? Is there anything we missed? Is there anything you would like to add about OPSS?
No, I mean, to go back to the very beginning of this conversation, I am not a regular contributor to Task and Purpose. I don't really think of myself as an op-ed type person, but I do strongly believe that when there's a problem that you see and that other people might not seeing it, part of our responsibility as leaders in the military and outside of it is to take that moment and say, hey, I'm going to raise my hand and say, what's going on here? So I certainly hope that anyone who's listening to this podcast who sees something else, we need those voices. We need people at all levels of our military to stand up and raise their hand when something's not going up wrong. It doesn't mean you're cutting the chain of command or doing the wrong thing or being insubordinate, but it does mean making sure that everyone, to include both our military and civilian leaders, have the visibility into these problems so that everyone can do their part to contribute to us having the most lethal fighting force in the world.
Is there a more direct route for raising the attention of this? I know from reading, what was it, 6130.06, the DoD instruction on the policy. There's a board, there's a council that is specifically for this policy. Can we contact them, say, we need this fixed?
Absolutely. There are a lot of levels that people can get engaged. You can get engaged at the level of that board and contacting them and reaching out directly through the OPSS even has a link on their website where you can ask them questions. And certainly I'm sure that's a way to get feedback directly to them. At a different level, you can also contact your members of Congress who have a lot of oversight responsibilities over the Department of Defense and all of its components, including the Uniformed Services Health Sciences University that puts together, that houses that committee that creates the OPSS. And again, from the perspective of individual service members, I wrote this article because it was the easiest way to kind of get the word out more generally and to start a conversation that I don't think was happening. And it's been great to see the response have been, several Congress people have been interested. Several people have started sharing their stories about different things, different eras, how this stuff was handled, some critical feedback as well, all of which helps contribute to a conversation where we get to a solution, because it's not an easy problem to solve. It's not. As you said, there's a lot of nuance to it. But again, my perspective is always, it's less about, complaining to the right person and more about making sure the information is out there so that wherever the right person is, they're going to be able to hear it and then take appropriate action.
All right. Well, thank you very much. There's a lot of really good information. I think that's a perfect time to segue into the final segment, the countdown to impact. This is 3, 2, 1. 3 books, 2 quotes, and 1 person who have all made an impact in your life.
Yeah, so I'll start with the books. I think the first one I'll mention is a book I just finished. It's called The Digital Fourth Amendment by Oren Kerr. It's a book by a law professor, but I think anyone could read it. And it's important because it talks about, as so much of our life moves online, how do we still create a system where we respect everyone's privacy? I think that's something that is relevant to all of us, both as citizens and just as people living in the society. The next book that I'd mention is a classic one. It's Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. It's an old one, but I think for me, was a really powerful book to return to in this time where I think America gets wrapped up in itself a lot. And it's refreshing both to return to, this Frenchman's perspective on where we were at in the early days in our country, both in it's a way of getting in touch with what America was really about at the beginning, and also remembering that we are not an island. We are part of a broader world that observes us and sees us perhaps differently than how we see ourselves. The final book I'll mention is not really in the same category at all, but it's a novel by the Russian author Vladimir Nabokov called Tin. It's one of my favorites. It's about a Russian professor who comes to America and works at a university that's, I think, modeled off of Wesleyan, so this small liberal arts college. And he's pretty alone throughout the book, alone in America. But I think he sort of celebrates his aloneness. And I think in a completely connected world, we often find ourselves alone. And I think sometimes that's not so bad. 2 quotes. One quote that I've returned to again and again, and I think probably many people in the military have returned to again and again, is from Ovid, the Roman poet, from his Metamorphoses book. It's, "Be patient and tough. Someday this pain will be useful to you." I think often we're in situations where we're hurting. I certainly work with people who are in those situations all the time. And it can be difficult to see in that moment how the pain will be useful to us. And even if it's never useful to us, I think the hope that it will be can get us through. The second quote that came to mind was from the English poet and preacher who at one time was the most well-known preacher in England, John Donne. And we get a lot of words from this poem. We've all heard probably the term "for whom the bell tolls" or "no man is an island." And it's from that same poem of his that those famous phrases come from. But the quote I like from it most is, he says, "Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind." I know I'm religious. I imagine sometimes you have been too, Aaron. But even for those of us who are not, I think we all can acknowledge that whether we're in the military or not, that we're all part of something greater. And finally, 1 person. I'm not going to be very original, but I'm going to have to say my mom, because my mom taught me to question everything. And she questions everything I do, and she always gives me shit for everything, whether it's not coming home for New Year's or whether it's joining the military. And I think having her ask those questions and teaching me to ask my own questions has made me a lot better of a person.
Those are excellent contributions to the countdown. Some fresh book suggestions, and I love those quotes. I can't wait to put to share those book recommendations and give them a read myself. All right, final three questions. One actually is, what's your favorite flavor of crayon?
I love the red ones. For some reason, they just taste like home.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, the last two real questions. One is, if anybody wanted to connect, find out more about you, or where would they go? Where would you send them?
So I don't have a big online presence or anything like that, but I do have an email. You can email me at max@goldberg.esq. It's pretty easy. So I'm pretty good at responding to emails. I got a few in response to the article, so don't hesitate to reach out.
That's Goldberg, right?
That's right. Either like the View host or the wrestler, depending on your predilections.
All right. And final question is, what's your definition of living a life of impact?
I've always thought of something from the Talmud, which is the sort of Jewish commentaries on the Bible, which says that the worth of our life is measured not by what we do in it, but by how people remember us after we're gone.
Well, Max, Captain, thank you very much for sharing this information, helping to educate the Disruptor Nation, and keeping our troops out of trouble. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for having me on, Aaron, and thank you for all the service you've done to our country. I know we all are grateful for it.